For years, a private hell lay hidden behind the walls of a school in Iztapalapa. No one could have imagined that a janitor's quarters, just a few feet from a classroom, would bear witness to one of Mexico's most disturbing and shadowy tales. A mother, three children, and a man who, beneath a kind and cultured exterior, concealed unimaginable secrets. What the police uncovered in 2011 sent a shockwave through the entire nation. And what you are about to hear is something you will never forget. If you want to know the full story, be sure to watch the entire video. Clara Tapia Herrera was born on August 12, 1968, in Chiautla, Puebla. She was the ninth of 11 siblings. From a very young age, her life was marked by violence. A relative sexually abused her for 3 years, as did one of her primary school teachers. Friends and family remember her as a fearful, reserved, deeply quiet, and unsociable child. She disliked leaving the house when she was little, and this tendency only intensified in her teenage years. She was described as an antisocial young woman. She spoke to no one, avoided contact with others, and found it incredibly difficult to make friends with people her own age. Despite everything she had endured, Clara excelled in her studies. In primary and secondary school, she consistently earned the highest grades. After finishing high school, she moved from Puebla to Mexico City to continue her education. There, she enrolled in the Military School of Nursing. Her academic performance was excellent, but just 3 months before graduation, she was expelled. The reason? She had become pregnant, an act that was strictly forbidden for students at the institution at that time. The father of her first child refused to take responsibility for the pregnancy, and although she was able to eventually finish her degree, he completely distanced himself from Clara. She was left a single mother. On April 18, 1989, at the age of 21, she gave birth to Rebecca, her firstborn. Being a single mother was not easy. Without a completed degree and with her entire family back in Puebla, life in the city became an uphill battle. 2 years later, Clara met another man and began a relationship. He was a construction worker. Together, they had 2 more children, Gabriela and a boy they named Ricardo. According to Clara, this man was initially good to her and the children. He treated them well and seemed to be a source of support. Over time, however, he began to mistreat them. All the money he earned from construction he spent on alcohol and treating his friends. He contributed almost nothing to the household. Faced with this situation, Clara had to find work to feed her children. She found a job as a janitor at a primary school in Iztapalapa. Her salary was enough to maintain the household, and a significant benefit of the job was that she didn't have to pay rent. Many educational institutions in Mexico and other Latin American countries offer their janitors a small annexed living space on or within the school grounds. This allowed her to save on rent. It wasn't a high salary, but it was enough for food and to ensure her children could attend school. During that time, the teachers at the school described her as a cheerful woman. Although they knew she faced problems, she always tried to handle them in the best way she could. Her children, though dressed very humbly, were always clean and well presented. As time went on, the situation changed. Clara's second husband began to abuse both her and the children. According to her testimony, he beat her on several occasions. Finally, after they had all been living in the janitor's quarters for some time, the man abandoned them to move to the United States, where he started a new family. They never heard from him again. Clara, always thinking of her children's future, opened a savings fund. She managed to save 85,000 Mexican pesos with the intention of giving them a better life. However, to keep up with the payments for the fund and cover other necessities, she had to take on a second job. She began working as a cleaner in a furniture showroom. It was at the furniture showroom that Clara met Jorge Inestra Salas, the security guard. Jorge told her he came from a wealthy family, that he was a graduate of a renowned public university, and that his job as a security guard was little more than a hobby, as his family's financial backing meant he never truly needed to work. Clara remembers seeing him as a cultured man. He spoke to her about books, classical music, and other subjects that, at the time, were foreign to her. She was completely dazzled by him. A friendship began which within a few months blossomed into a romantic relationship. Weeks after starting their relationship, Clara and Jorge decided to live together. They didn't move into his house, but into the janitor's quarters where Clara lived with her children. It was the year 2004 when Clara opened the doors of her home to him. At first, everything seemed to be going very well. Jorge won the trust of Clara's 3 children with gifts, kind treatment, and a friendly demeanor. At home, everyone seemed happy. To the school's teachers, Jorge didn't seem like a bad person. They saw him coming and going from the quarters, but since there were no apparent problems, they didn't ask questions about who he was or if he would be staying there permanently. As the months passed, they began to notice changes. The attitude of Clara and her children shifted. It all started when they began to enclose the janitor's quarters patio. It had a small connection to the school, and from the school grounds one could see what was happening in that patio. Little by little, using sheets of metal and pieces of wood, they began to seal it off until it was almost completely isolated from the educational institution. Initially, when the teachers noticed what was happening, they informed the school principal. However, he chose not to intervene. He told them to leave Clara alone, explaining that he wanted her to be as comfortable as possible with her children and her new partner. Although the situation seemed strange, Clara was an excellent worker, and many thought she deserved a bit of privacy and the right to make changes to her living space. No one imagined she would one day leave. Still, Clara's attitude began to change. A difference had been noticeable since her second husband left for the United States. But with the arrival of Jorge Inestra, that change became more pronounced. Clara was almost always in a bad mood. Her responses were curt and she rarely left the janitor's quarters. Soon the teachers realized that Clara's children, who had always been clean and well cared for, now appeared dirty and disheveled, their appearance showing clear signs of neglect. They also learned that all 3 had stopped attending classes. At one point, they saw the youngest, Ricardo, begging for money at traffic lights and searching for food in the trash. They even learned he was working as a pepenador, a waste picker, scavenging through garbage to bring a little money home. All of this was strange, as Clara still had her 2 jobs. They didn't provide for luxuries, but they were enough to cover the basics, just as they had before. However, as time went on, the children, especially Rebecca and Gabriella, were seen less and less, and Ricardo's situation worsened. The teachers decided to speak with the principal again. This time, he too began to suspect that something serious was happening in that place. He finally went to the education board to file a formal complaint, but instead of finding support from the authorities, the principal ended up losing his job. For daring to report the situation, he spent a year in uncertainty. No one knew for sure what was happening to Clara's children, or even to Clara herself. The only thing that was evident was that with each passing day, her partner seemed to have more and more control over her life. It was a year after Jorge Inestra had moved into the janitor's quarters that they learned Rebecca, one of Clara's daughters, was pregnant. They only saw her in that state once. After that, no one knew if she had gone to a hospital to give birth, if the birth had occurred inside the house, or even if the baby had been born at all, as its cry was never heard. The situation reached such an extreme that only Jorge ever left the quarters. He was in charge of buying all the food and any other products the family needed. If something extra was required, someone would go and ask Clara for it. But she wouldn't come out. She would only open a small window through which she would pass the items, always careful to ensure no one could see inside the home. The behaviors within that household grew increasingly bizarre. During this time, there was a change of principal at the school. The new principal had no clear grasp of the situation or knowledge of what had been happening. Between 2005 and 2006, an influenza epidemic forced the suspension of classes for a time. When they resumed, the entire school had to be cleaned, and the new principal decided that Jorge Inestra would do the job. Meanwhile, a rumor began to circulate among the parents. They said that Jorge drank heavily, that he was irresponsible, that he kept the family in poor conditions, and that there was something very strange about his behavior. The unease grew so much that several parents began to report his presence and demand that he not be allowed near their children. As that year progressed, the parents' complaints mounted. Many were convinced that something was wrong with Jorge Inestra, but they also knew the education board would not support them in removing him. So they began to pressure the teachers and the principal to intervene. Jorge noticed the growing discontent among the parents and the increasing number of complaints. He understood that sooner or later the authorities might show up to investigate what was happening in the janitor's quarters. So he decided to leave, abandoning Clara for good. He took Rebecca and Gabriela with him to live at his own parents' house. Clara remained in the quarters with her son Ricardo, although he spent many nights at the house where his sisters were, supposedly to help with some chores. Clara, on the other hand, almost never went to that place. Years passed, and in July of 2011, the prosecutor's office received a complaint from Clara Tapia Herrera. In it, she accused her ex-partner Jorge Inestra of mistreatment and domestic violence. She stated that she had not been able to see or speak to her daughters for years, and that her only contact was with Jorge, who always told her that they didn't want to see her. Clara also claimed that Jorge treated her son Ricardo with extreme cruelty. The complaint uncovered a series of grave situations that had allegedly occurred both in the janitor's quarters and in the house where Jorge lived with Gabriela and Rebecca. According to Clara, he had initially presented himself as an attentive man, giving gifts, treating the family well, and seeming to be a good partner. She never imagined his behavior would change so completely. Over time, she asserted, he engaged in inappropriate conduct with her daughters and was cruel to Ricardo, sending him into the streets to beg for money or scavenge for coins, which he would then use for his own expenses. Clara recounted that she had held up to 4 jobs at one point to support Jorge. As time went on and their life with him intensified, things worsened drastically. It reached a point where he not only behaved horribly toward her daughters, but practically banished Clara and her son Ricardo from the house, sending them to a small patio covered with metal sheets and wood, a makeshift annex where they could barely find shelter. Clara recalled that she could only see Rebecca and Gabriela through a tiny window. Jorge had even invented a point system. Each time she gave him money or bought him something, she would accumulate points. Only when she reached 100 points was she allowed to open the window to see her daughters. During that time, Clara and Ricardo suffered from hunger and cold. They had no dignified place to sleep or protect themselves. Life for them became unbearable, and for Rebecca and Gabriela inside the house, it was no better. According to Clara's account, they suffered constant assaults from Jorge. As a consequence of this situation between the two of them, they had 5 of his children with no one on the outside knowing what was happening. Physical abuse was also a daily reality for Clara, Ricardo, Gabriela, and Rebecca. This was not the life any of them had ever imagined. Clara explained that Jorge had absolute control over her money. He took the 85,000 pesos she had saved in her fund, as well as all the cards where she received her salary. Although it wasn't a large income, he spent it on whatever he wanted: alcohol, women, or luxuries for himself. On one occasion, Clara tried to report him but received no support. When Jorge took her daughters, she remained in the janitor's quarters with her younger son, however. Ricardo frequently went to the house where Jorge, Gabriela, and Rebecca lived. According to Clara, what happened inside that sinister family home was no better. Rebecca and Gabriela spent years locked inside a room measuring just 15 square meters. They had a bed, a small refrigerator, and few other things to survive on. They did not leave that room at all, not even for their basic needs, which they were forced to relieve in a bucket. Every time Ricardo came to the house, Jorge forced him to empty and clean that bucket with his bare hands. The hygienic conditions were deplorable. Foul odors constantly emanated from the place. All of this was happening in Jorge's family home, and both his mother and his siblings were aware of the situation. In fact, his sister was the one who would go out to buy milk for the children Jorge had with the young women. The sisters recounted that the only times they left that room were to give birth, and on many occasions Jorge would present them at hospitals or health centers as his official partners. No one seemed to ask questions despite the girls' obvious young age. They had no contact with the outside world. Their only daily exit from the room was to shower, always under the watchful eye of Jorge, who never left them alone for a moment. There was a window, but they were forbidden from opening it in his absence. Nevertheless, they often felt the need to look outside, to disconnect from the life they were living inside. On one occasion, Jorge found one of them looking out the window, and his reaction was violent. Finally, on September 6, 2011, the police managed to enter the residence and free the young women who were there. Among them, they found Gabriela with 5 children, but Rebecca was not there. It was then that Gabriela recounted what had happened to her sister. Jorge did not like it when anyone looked out the window. One day, upon returning from work, Jorge found Rebecca looking out, and his reaction was one of savage violence. He began to beat her repeatedly with a pipe, a beating of such brutality that it stole her life, leaving her body crumpled on the floor. In the moments that followed, Jorge didn't know what to do. He took Gabriela's youngest child, a baby girl, and placed her on Rebecca's chest. He was convinced, as he would later claim, that this act could somehow revive her. But he pressed down with so much force that he suffocated the infant. On that day, both Rebecca and her tiny niece lost their lives. Disoriented, Jorge decided to hide the bodies. He placed them under the bed where they would remain for an entire month. During that time, Gabriela was forced to care for the other children in that same room. She had to feed them and sleep on that very bed, knowing that the bodies of her sister and her own daughter lay just inches below. To mask the growing stench, Jorge began to sprinkle lime over the corpses. But as the days turned into weeks, the odor became overwhelming. Jorge's mother finally confronted him, asking what he intended to do. At last, he asked his brother for help to dispose of the remains. At the time, Jorge was working as a taxi driver. He used his own taxi to transport the bodies. He and his brother drove out onto the highway that connects Puebla with Mexico City, and there they abandoned the remains of Rebecca and the baby. None of these children had ever been registered with the civil authorities. They had no birth certificates. They were known by names, but no official document existed to confirm their identity or their age. After disposing of the bodies, Jorge returned home as if nothing had happened. A subsequent police investigation confirmed the events, establishing that it all took place in 2009. That same year, 2 bodies, those of a young woman and a baby girl, had been found. At the time, they could not be identified and were buried in a common grave as unregistered persons. It struck many as strange that Clara Tapia, Rebecca's mother, had gone 2 years without seeing her daughter. According to her own account, she had no idea that Rebecca was dead. It wasn't until 2011 that she finally filed a report. Jorge's family was also harshly questioned for allowing such horrors to unfold inside their home. The findings were sickening, and Clara's testimony shocked the public. The case sent a tremor through all of Mexico. In the end, Jorge and several of his family members were sent to prison. However, just days after the investigation began, the situation took a dramatic turn. Based on Jorge's statements, Clara went from being considered a victim to being seen as a participant. He claimed that she had consented to his actions and had even allowed him to have his way with her daughters. The police decided to detain her, arguing that, as a mother, she had a duty to protect her children and not allow them to be abused for so long. Clara, along with Jorge's mother and sister, were sent to the same women's preventive center, while Jorge and his brother were transferred to a men's prison, all awaiting trial. Soon a campaign emerged to secure Clara's release. Although social media at the time lacked the power it has today, a movement grew on Facebook and other platforms. Several women's associations spoke out in her defense. After 2 years, in 2013, Clara was finally cleared of all charges. The court determined that she had, in fact, been a victim in the ordeal. Her release, however, was delayed. When she was first rescued, her daughter Gabriela had declared that her mother had never cared for them, that she had witnessed the abuse and had never tried to stop it. Clara defended herself by presenting the testimony of her own sister, who confirmed that in early 2011 they had already tried to file a complaint, but the authorities had simply dismissed her as a bad mother. This was one of the reasons her legal process dragged on for so long. The judge ordered a review of all evaluations and mandated that Gabriela receive prolonged psychological treatment. After completing this therapy, she was interviewed again. This time, Gabriela explained that when she gave her first statement, she was filled with rage at her mother for everything she had endured. But with time and therapy, she came to understand that Clara had been a victim too. Thanks to this new testimony, Clara finally regained her freedom. For his part, Jorge Inestra was sentenced in 2015 to 241 years in prison and ordered to pay a fine of 665,000 pesos, equivalent to about $40,000. His mother received a 20-year sentence and each of his siblings 18 years. The life of Clara Tapia and her children had been a living nightmare. From 2004 to 2011, Jorge Inestra had entered their lives pretending to be a quiet, almost exemplary man. He won their trust with gifts and kind gestures, but once inside, he revealed his true nature. According to Clara's statements, Jorge convinced her that everything they were experiencing was normal for middle-class families. She claimed that at the time she simply didn't know how to react to that reality. To this day, the whereabouts of Gabriela, Ricardo, and the other children who survived the ordeal remain unknown. It is known that Clara, after her release, appeared on some television programs and became involved as an activist in the defense of women's rights. However, there is no information about where she lives or which organizations she participates in. All signs suggest that she and her children have sought to build a new life, with a new identity, far from the social judgment of what they were forced to endure. The press nicknamed Jorge Inestra the monster of Iztapalapa for the sheer scale of his crimes and because they took place in that area. The case of Clara Tapia and Jorge Inestra is one of the most harrowing episodes of family violence and systematic abuse in Mexico's history. It reveals not only the brutality of one individual, but also the grave negligence of institutions and of those close to the family who, knowing what was happening, failed to intervene in time. The manipulation, isolation, and total control exercised by Jorge over Clara and her children show how violence can take root and perpetuate itself when there is fear economic dependence, and a lack of effective support networks. This case reminds us of the importance of believing victims from the very first moment, offering them real protection and not minimizing their reports. It also proves that violence is not always visible, and that isolation is one of the most dangerous tools an abuser can wield. Society, families, and authorities must act early and in coordination because indifference and silence can cost lives.